winning the FFPC Main Event. That is what we are doing today on RotoViz Overtime. We are about to jump straight in. We got the 101. We got the first overall pick. We're hoping, Shawn, that people are listening back to this episode again, early January, maybe even late December, to see what moves we made to win $1 million in the FFPC Main Event. So that is what we are going to do on this edition. Shawn, you've had a planes, trains, and automobiles kind of 48 hours, I think, as to get to this point, to get back on the clock. It's been a lot of travel. You may not want to talk about the travel, but how are you feeling here as we approach this draft? Are we all set to absolutely crush here from the 101?
We are all set. Colm. I mean, life is just tricky, and there are a lot more things going on than having to spend an extra day at an airport. But I've got to tell you, flying American Airlines or flying through Dallas is not particularly appealing right now. We waited at the airport all day on Saturday, and there were people there who were waiting since Thursday because of all the flights that have been canceled. People who had been there since Thursday on that flight, they delayed it from 5 o'clock in the afternoon until 1 a.m. because they were searching for a pilot and a flight attendant. And, it gets tricky. You don't really think about all the logistics. All of the planes that couldn't take off because they didn't have full crews, or blocking gates for planes that might have actual people who could come in and crew those planes so they could take off. And so you have planes out there who have landed that are just sitting out on the tarmac for hours. But I think it would have all been fine, and people would have understood if they had not been able to find a crew, or what have you. But in the end, they did get the full crew there. And the flight attendants, the last couple of flight attendants, because they actually had 2 additional flight attendants show up, and they were begging American Airlines to let them on the plane and to fly the plane. And you could hear them, talking into their phones saying, these people have been waiting here for 6 hours, which some of the people who had the earlier Tucson flight that had been canceled have been waiting for much longer than that. The people who had been there since Thursday had obviously been waiting much longer than that. They had the full crew there. They canceled it at 1:01 a.m. and the next flights out through them were today, right? And so that's like, we're going to cancel this at 1 o'clock, despite the fact that you guys have been waiting here all day, and despite the fact that we actually have the full crew now, even though we can't also fly you tomorrow. And I thought it was going to be in the middle of a riot. I've never been in a public place with that many angry, shouting people at the same time. So anyway, you hear all the time that the American airline system is starting to become more and more like the European one, which my understanding is basically just doesn't work, which was certainly my experience when I flew back from Turkey a couple of years ago.
Before we get into the draft, my experience has been that the US one doesn't work, and I've had one canceled flight in like the last 15 years in the European system. I feel like it's much more Wild West out there in the US, where it's just like flights go on to whatever time of night they go, and then flights may be canceled, gates may be changed. So I don't want to get our European counterparts where I'm from over here a bad name. But Shawn was updating me from some emails, and it was a tricky time. I had a lot of sympathy, and it's a tough situation. But, Shawn, those people who were there from Thursday, tough time indeed. But Shawn, we are on board here, and we are ready for takeoff. We have the 101, as I mentioned, and we selected Ja'Marr Chase. The draft is ongoing. We're moving through it, but we are into the second round. Shawn, we got the 101. You messaged me over. We have the 101. I was like, is there any conversation that it's not Ja'Marr Chase? It's pretty simple, I think, when you have the 101, that's the direction you have to go. I've talked a little bit about the turn picks and having to pick twice, and then you're waiting those 20 plus picks till it gets back to you. Can be a little bit difficult, and making some reaches or taking some players that are maybe we would have ranked higher, but the ADP isn't at that point. But when you're playing here, Shawn, the FFPC Main Event for all the marbles, $1 million up top, I think this is the time to make those, if you want to quotation mark them as reaches, today is the day to do that. So we'll see here what we do at the 2-3 turn. But Ja'Marr Chase, the clear selection there at the 101. Any thoughts you want to add on Ja'Marr Chase, other than, like, we know he's Ja'Marr Chase, and Ja'Marr Chase does Ja'Marr Chase things?
Yeah, you think about the week 17 a few years ago where he went off against the Kansas City Chiefs. You think about the entire season last year where he was unstoppable. Part of that was simply a huge number of routes. He and Jerry Jeudy were up there at the top. Obviously, Jerry Jeudy getting punished because people don't think that will happen again. I mean, Jamar Chase may be closer than he would otherwise be to this group of Bijan Robinson, Gibbs, Lamb, Bowers, Barkley, than he would otherwise be. I mean, if you were just looking at last year, there would be a big gap. And now he does go at the 101 most of the time. I've got a lot of main event teams already with Brock Bowers. You and I have lots of Bowers. I mean, he's been my top ranked player in specifically FFPC tight end premium for most of the year. I switched that recently just so it wouldn't be confusing, because I do think that people should be taking Chase at the top due to the fact you don't have as many chances. Now, maybe if you just have one draft, you might still go with Brock Bowers there. So I want to note that. But Jamar Chase, he is targeted relentlessly underneath. That rounds out his profile. He's fine at the intermediate areas. He can get over the top. He had the 13 catches of 30-plus yards last season. 9 of them went for touchdowns. That might be a little bit fluky, but with Jamar Chase, what you get is the finish, right? You get the touchdown. What you get with the Cincinnati Bengals are a lot of shootouts, a lot of points, and you get those touchdowns. He is the 101.
So we'll be moving in here to the 2-3 turn, and obviously we have the back-to-back picks. We thankfully have a 60-second clock if we need to talk through some of these picks as it happens later on. But interested, Shawn, to see who you think, like in terms of some of the priority targets, and I don't think that we'll see him go before it gets to our pick, but somebody in this format like a Travion Henderson would be interesting. I know I'm the one that's usually pushing wide receivers all the time, and always feel a little bit bad when we do take some of these running backs, but there's a couple of names that are very intriguing when it comes to potentially loading up in this particular format. Henderson will be one of those. We have seen as far down as Achan going off the board here through the second half of the second, or the first half of the second round. It's kind of like being running back, wide receiver, the last few picks. Josh Jacobs, Chase Brown, all going off the board. You get into the likes of a George Kittle would be interesting for me at this particular point. Bucky Irvin was going in the conversation. He's just gone. So we're one pick away, Shawn. Who are some of the names that you would like to add to the roster here?
Well, the two guys who in the last few days have been at the 2-3 turn are A.J. Brown and Ladd McConkey. I think those are viable picks. They're not my favorite picks. They were going earlier, though, throughout most of the offseason. So you could argue that they actually are discounted now to prices that make them pretty compelling. Interestingly enough, they do both go, which means that Jonathan Taylor gets back to us. He seems like a really easy selection here. And then George Kittle is potentially the other guy. Now, I've been watching the tight ends doing these drafts. They have been falling. Hawkinson might even come back to the 612. We can always take Sam Laporta at the 501 if we don't like our other options there. Colm, are you good with Taylor as the first of the two picks?
Yeah, let's take Taylor. It feels like that's one, Shawn, that we keep kind of backdooring ourselves into, but I say backdooring. It's a really strong pick, with this particular stands of the draft, and we can talk through Taylor in a moment. You mentioned George Kittle, and you mentioned then the other names that may get back to us if they do fall. I don't know if you're suggesting that would allow us to get two of these tight ends, because that's something that I would be open to getting both of them if you wanted to take Kittle here as a priority and then see how it plays out. Or are you thinking about taking a second running back here?
I'm thinking about, I think the JSN is pretty interesting here. He's probably a little bit undervalued and would go. I have a ton of Henderson, so I'm certainly not pushing him. I think he's a viable pick. I have a decent amount of Lamar Jackson. I think he and Jaden Daniels are viable picks. They're not going to come back. Tetairoa McMillan is not going to come back. I want to get your guy, your preference with this selection.
Well, my guy has been George Kittle, but I'm open to also going with the JSN. I think let's go Kittle. I'm very open in this particular format of having two tight ends if we have to go in that direction. The one part I really don't like when my teams end up getting boxed out at the tight end position, like let's say in this now, and it's a good test, because if we're looking at the kind of ADP, Hawkinson generally in the late 6th round, but usually like 6'9", 6'10" in terms of where he's going. And in this instance, if it's a case that he doesn't get back to us when we're going at that particular point of the draft, I know that we can still fall back on maybe an Evan Ingram or David Njoku, but you start to get into a little bit of a tougher window. And the one thing I have found in some of the FFPC stuff, picking at the 1 or 2 or 3 pick, is a lot of the ADP for these tight ends is at the more based on the middle or the back of the round. So that would be my concern, is if we pass up there to miss out on him. I did do a solo show that I posted where I went through some of the ownerships of the players that I have on the FFPC, and the one player that I did mention that I was actually disappointed as to how low he has ended up is George Kittle, because I've been talking about him kind of all off season long, but just based on how drafts have played out, he isn't somebody that's ended up on as many of my rosters as I would have thought. But let's head on JT and Kittle. Taylor is somebody, Shawn, I think we've drafted quite a few times together at that 2-3 turn, and I think that it's just a case of like there's not a huge amount of reason to not take him there, other than the fact like if he just failed to be able to play in the NFL anymore. We all know what Taylor can do, and I think he's going to be set up for a massive workload in this offense.
Yeah, I have him as a target. I put out the updated, and I love putting it together this way. I think in some ways it's actually more useful than the rankings themselves. It's actually easier to do than the rankings, which is nice. We do obviously have questions about the rankings from time to time, and I try and make sure I update those at the same time that when I have the new date on, that they are, sort of fully updated at that point, which means just managing, so many players in a lot of different formats. But it's also an element where you don't want your rankings. I don't like to have a huge ADP element in my rankings, although there's a tiny little bit to make sure people, don't go completely off the rails if they're drafting off of that and not off of like a combination of that and their specific ADP. One of the reasons I don't like to put ADP in too much is that people are playing in different formats, right? And so it's going to have a different element if you're drafting an FFPC versus CBS versus NFL.com versus Yahoo, what have you. When you go through it like this, you can see it in a way where it's like, what are my decisions when I'm on the clock, as opposed to how should I take this person who's ranked here but is positioned somewhere else. That article is up. I also have some kind of working through the different stages of the draft in that article. And then I also have a positional or structural breakdown in terms of tactics. One of the names that I have as a target, for me, I'm actually a little bit surprised to look at this and see that it's just target and not priority target on Jonathan Taylor. He was the top fantasy weapon in 2021. He probably is set to be this year as Saquon Barkley. You think about that big play ability. Taylor was the overall RB3 during last year's fantasy playoffs, and that was only because Jahmyr Gibbs and Chase Brown also scored a huge number of points. He had 58 and 70-yard runs in weeks 10 and 16, which clocked as the 10th and 11th fastest running back times in 2024. I know that when you're looking at some different efficiency metrics, you're going to see those bounce all over the place. And Taylor, frankly, Barkley as well. One of the things I mentioned throughout last year was that Barkley was actually not generating great peripherals outside of the big runs. Now, that obviously means to you that for someone like Barkley, the peripherals don't matter very much. And so you shouldn't worry so much about that as simply, what is the offense doing for him? Is he creating big runs? If he is, you don't care that when he faces a defender in the backfield, he goes down a little bit more easily than most running backs do. It's kind of irrelevant. That's not what you drafted Saquon Barkley for. When you look at someone like a Breece Hall, his peripherals were terrible last year. I wouldn't be that worried about that if he were in a good situation for 2025. He's probably not. You look at Jonathan Taylor, you also run into some situations where maybe the peripherals aren't perfect. Again, that probably doesn't matter that much for him. What you're concerned about with Taylor is he healthy? Is he still fast? Is he still breaking big plays? What did he do down the stretch of the last season? Which, again, not that you want to draft him specifically because of that. If we were, we'd be drafting him in the top 5. Right. We know that those last 3 weeks don't tell us the whole story, but the last 3 weeks do answer questions about, like, is Jonathan Taylor fading as an NFL running back? Obviously not. When you have a player like that at the 212, it's just such an easy automatic pick. I've had him ranked barely ahead of Derrick Henry most of the offseason. There was a little window where I moved Henry up like one spot above him before it became really obvious that Keaton Mitchell was going to be a star. Now, we had Keaton Mitchell very aggressively ranked throughout the entire process, but then you get to preseason and you're like, there's no too high for Keaton Mitchell you come back and you look at that with where Derrick Henry is now at the 1-2 turn. I really think that their ADPs should be flipped. Now, that doesn't mean that that's guaranteed to happen. Derrick Henry is so good. This could easily be the right way, but I love taking Jonathan Taylor at this point. And then with George Kittle, you get a really efficient player. You get a great run after the catch guy. And we do expect the 49ers to be maybe a little bit more in shootouts than they have been in the past. And for that to happen, it's going to have to rely to an extent on Kittle. We've had some questions about Pearsall. I've actually sort of moved in the direction of the sentiment that most of those questions have sort of posed. But even if you have good performance from Pearsall, the way that the 49ers are structured right now, I mean, you need George Kittle to play. And from that perspective, and I say play, I mean, you need him to score. He's got to really drive the engine of that offense. He's a nice selection here, in part for the reasons that you mentioned. One of the things with Laporta is that if you take him at 501, you're passing on some really good players, and you may not have that opportunity. Sam Laporta went in the middle of the third round in this draft.
Yeah, that was one thing, and it'd be interesting to see if that pulls some tight ends up a little bit after the conversation we had in the kind of start of the show with the Kittle pick. He usually goes in around the 5-10, so pulled up 2 rounds, and then the other guys that go after him, Kelsey, Warren, Hawkinson, we'll see if people jump aboard that. We did have Josh Allen make it to the 401, the 402 Lamar Jackson, so they dropped a little bit. Shawn, I don't think we can even get super optimistic and hope for a fall in Jaden Daniels, but that would be absolutely fantastic. The other names that we talked about, Travion Henderson, he went at the 304. Jackson Smith and Jigba went at the 308, and then Ted McMillan went at the 310. They were all obviously players that we knew wouldn't get back to us. They would have been in the conversation at the 301. George Kittle, Shawn there, and it'll, again, in hindsight, in 10 rounds time, we'll know what could have played out at the tight end position if we had passed there. If we pass on Kittle there, JSN is actually my highest rostered player, which I mentioned on that other podcast that I was very surprised as to how much I had drafted him over the course of 2025, because he was somebody at the start I felt maybe was a little bit overpriced. He's kind of dropped back a little bit into the middle of the round, but he has been somebody I've consistently ended up drafting. Who would have been the pick for you if we didn't pick George Kittle there, just so we can decide in hindsight if we would have won the main event based on the different player selection?
I think it would have been Jackson Smith and Jigba, in part because I've actually drafted a ton of Henderson at very high prices. We've gotten lucky/unlucky because, again, we talk about how good that beginning of the second round is. And so you love to get exposure to some of those players. I mean, Brian Thomas in round 2 is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
At the same time, you can't complain when you get Jonathan Taylor, which I just explained, I think is a good pick, at 112, 201. When you have a bunch of picks in the top 4, which, again, you can't complain about being able to get the very top guys, then you're not getting a lot of Travion Henderson at good prices. And so if you still want him, I've just basically been loading up on him super expensively, and then also have a decent amount of expensive Lamar Jackson. And so those are the 2 guys that I really like there outside of Kittle, and then JSN probably the next. So for me, exposure wise, JSN would have made a lot of sense. But again, I want to make sure that we get your favorite players in this draft as we go through.
That was a dagger, Shawn. Jaden Daniels did go. I was kind of starting to have that feeling of hope, but the hope has been extinguished. He goes 3 picks before our pick. That would have been fantastic. George Pickens was going to be the next name I was going to pitch there. It does feel like if RJ Harvey gets another pick, that he's probably the direction we should go here, along with a wide receiver. Open to a variety of names. We haven't really been targeting Jalen Hurts over the course of the offseason and into draft season. It was interesting in this. I started to get really optimistic on the Jaden Daniels possibility when Joe Burrow went ahead of him. So that pushed a couple of names down here by ADP who would usually potentially have been already off the board. But RJ Harvey gets to us. Then we obviously have a conversation around, Jameson Williams, Amika Ibuka, who we want to go for at wide receiver. But are you on board with Harvey as the first option here?
Yeah, I've got a lot of expensive Harvey, but I don't think you can go wrong with expensive Harvey. So I do think that is the pick. I was hoping essentially that it would be anything other than one of those two guys at the 4-5 turn. Harvey and Williams being my two preferences. James Conner was the pick right ahead of us, so that pushes the people down. The other name, I did go ahead and click Harvey, so this probably is no longer really an option, but Breece Hall did fall to us. Once you're starting to talk about the 4-5 turn, then even with all of the issues, Breece Hall, is somewhat compelling again there. But Colm, Jameson Williams is here. Emeka Egbuka probably would be the next receiver name. Are we on the Lions' vertical superstar threat?
Yeah, I think that he's still the direction that I would go between him and Egbuka. Ibuka's price obviously is soared up, but I would still lean towards Williams. And I think it was on the podcast last week, Shawn, RotoViz OT, where I kind of touched on it when we talked about the setup for the Lions heading into this season. And I think that Williams, I don't think there hasn't been a huge amount of conversation around like projecting him for additional kind of routes and usage. And obviously, when we're looking at a lot, we've talked a lot about Sam Laporta, we've talked a lot about Amon-Ra, how the overall offense could play together with Gibbs in there. But I think Williams kind of is getting a little bit forgotten about, and I think he could take a big step forward this year in terms of like what people in the overall fantasy community, NFL community think of him, rather than just thinking of him as a kind of a deep play option. Think of him as a more all-rounder at the wide receiver position. So I still will be taking him over Egbuka based on that. And based on up in our wide receiver 2, I'm more comfortable with Williams over Egbuka. But it's pretty close. What's your feeling? That would you agree that there's like room for Williams' role to expand versus what we've seen through his career in the NFL so far?
Yeah, no question. And we got a lot more of that last year, along with a lot of manufactured touches. He was one of the guys, along with Jaden Reed and Xavier Worthy, where they ran the ball some. And I'm not saying that they're going to put up 100 yards and 3 touchdowns again this season. And some people will note that's not even like that many points, right? But it does give you another additional avenue for that weekly spike, which in managed is maybe not as important, but the scoring always matters. And so you think about guys like Xavier Worthy and Jameson Williams, especially, who are going to be in your lineup every week unless they hit like a 5% outcome, or you end up drafting such a powerful team that you're benching them because you're on the path to be the overall high scorer during the regular season, which if that's the case, then perfect. So we think through what Williams can give us from that perspective, and then you consider that the new offensive coordinator has been out there really kind of pounding the table for more vertical shots, and that what he was being used as a little bit more early in his career, that they want to make sure they're not forgetting to attack the defense deep. When you have a Ja'Marr Chase to start out your roster, and then you're thinking about someone, and again, this isn't ever to say that Jameson Williams is going to become Ja'Marr Chase, but the final season that Williams had in college, where he's playing still as a young player with Bryce Young, the two of them sort of drive the offense to the point where Bryce Young ends up eventually becoming the number 1 overall pick. I mean, that's on Jameson Williams. The speed, the ability to get behind the defense. One of the things that they talked a lot about in Detroit, and Jameson Williams was one of the buzziest players in fantasy football all year. And then in the last, couple of weeks, enough other players have gotten buzzy that he's pushed down some, right? The excitement for people about what the Dallas Cowboys are going to have to do just in general, but then certainly after the trade as well, where their defense gets weaker. You have Pickens continuing to rise, guys like Courtland Sutton, where the expectations for that Broncos offense. Then you have some of these names in terms of a Chuba Hubbard, a James Conner, where those guys are good. And I don't want it to sound like I don't think that Chuba or James Conner can play, because they can. They're very good starting running backs. But the insulation that they have, probably a little bit overstated. I don't think that you can draft dead zone-ish backs in that range when you have the possibility to draft someone like an RJ Harvey, who's probably going to beat them by leaps and bounds when it comes to receptions. Now, maybe the workload over the first month is so split or even so minimal that the Hubbard and Connor drafters are so far ahead of you after a month that you're going to have to really claw back. And then it's the question of, like, these regular seasons are fast. You have to make the playoffs. And it doesn't matter if you have the best team in week 13 if you're completely eliminated. But when you think about what Harvey could possibly do, and then this group of receivers, Calvin Ridley, someone that Ben and I took during the Big Gorilla Marathon, and we were kind of excited about that based on sort of how he looks with Cam Ward. We know what's happening with Abuka. But for Jameson Williams over the last 2 or 3 days to be all the way down at 508, that's a bit surprising in that you didn't have much chance of getting him after sort of 503, 504 until very recently. And so, Colm, certainly all of my teams that have these early picks are built for that click. And it's exciting to get him here because when I drafted the other day with my sister, I was lucky enough last year to win with you, to win with her, to win by myself, and to win with Ben. So we covered almost all of the bases there. She and I also had the 101 and drafted a chase team, but Jameson Williams did not get back to us even at 412, which was that was a bad deal. We had to come back and at like the 504 select Zay Flowers. Now, Flowers is a good choice, but he's someone who has been coming back almost to that pick in 6. And so it's nice to be in a draft here that is kind of mixed. It's not super wide receiver heavy, because then you can do some things like take the Jonathan Taylor pick, make the RJ Harvey pick, and not get wiped out, so that when we're back at 6 and 7, we won't be a half a round to a full round behind in terms of what the normal ADP is, because we actually want to make some very high upside receiver picks at 6 and 7 as well.
I love when you mention that with such confidence when there's a full round to go till it gets back to us. So there'll be 11 wide receivers drafted in a row here, I think, before we select next. But that is the key. When we take Chase, obviously you get your wide receiver there, but you take Taylor and Kittle, and then you're like, what do we do at the 4-5 turn? And then it's RJ Harvey. So sometimes we might want I feel a lot more comfortable in these drafts, if we have 3 wide receivers, let's say through 5. But the thing that I tend to find then, Shawn, is when we get into the season and we're setting those lineups and you slot in Jonathan Taylor and you slot in RJ Harvey, and you're like, well, we didn't have to scramble across the waiver wire on Sunday morning to see who we're going to start at running back. That adds a little bit of relaxation to your Sunday mornings. But you did mention, Shawn, and I just want to check, when James Conner went before RJ Harvey, and you said, I think the phrase was something to do with 2 players at the turn, and I couldn't tell if that was that you wanted these 2 players at the turn or if you wanted something different to happen. Was it that you were hoping that those 2 names would get to us?
Exactly. We had Pickens go at 410. And so you're potentially looking at this draft, and probably your best case scenario is to be able to draft Pickens, Jameson Williams at 412, 501. And then you have both of those guys with Chase, and then the foundation.
And that was kind of what I was thinking if Harvey went. If Harvey had gone, that was kind of what I was thinking. But yeah, we get Harvey, we get Williams. I think it's pretty good. So we'll see how it plays out over the course now, the next kind of 7, 8 picks. But we're in a pretty nice spot. Zay Flowers does go. There is one team 8, who has started Justin Jefferson, Drake London, JSN, Xavier Worthy, Emeka Ibuka. They're back on the clock. Will they go wide receiver again? I thought in that last round when they took Ibuka, they might have went TJ Hawkinson. I think if this is a TJ Hawkinson pick, Shawn, I think they're really starting to set up a pretty firepowered roster here. Tyler Warren did just go as the tight end 5 at the 603, so we'll see what happens with this pick. That went to a drafter who did start 4 wide receivers with Neighbors, Thomas, Ted McMillan, Terry McLaurin, Isaiah Pacheco, Tyler Warren. Shawn, that drafter in 8 did go with DeAndre Swift. If that lineup had went with TJ Hawkinson, I would have been very concerned about how that lineup was going to run out for number 8. Would Hawkinson have been the pick for you there on that roster?
He would have been. Now, there's the possibility that DeAndre Swift is the best pick in the first 10 rounds. They don't have a lot behind him. I do think that Kyle Monangai is probably one of the more undervalued players at this point in the draft season. Being an undervalued player, though, in the deep double digits simply means that people are probably not pricing the range of outcomes properly, but it is still centered in a very different area, obviously, than Swift's are. And so you work through that. If it doesn't end up being Monangai having a role, I mean, Swift has not been very good for quite a while. His peripherals, his different results when you look at things like what's he actually contributing to a team, the points above average per attempt, all of those numbers. I believe that those are -3 of the last 4 years and for multiple different organizations, right? I think he's got a bad year with the Lions, a bad year with the Eagles, a bad year with the Bears. So it becomes a little bit trickier to blame it on context. And that's the reason he's not going earlier. He is set up potentially in a nice situation if you assume he catches some passes, something that Breece Hall, Chuba Hubbard, unlikely to do. I think the real question will be, do Isaiah Pacheco and Tony Pollard, who went at 5'10 and 5'12, how many passes do they catch? If they use Pacheco in the passing game, he ends up being one of the best picks, at least over the first half of the season. If Tony Pollard takes all of what was earmarked for Tyjae Spears, because Spears was going to have a big role as a receiving back, it changes the game dramatically to have him out. As soon as he went out for a full month, you're probably looking at Tony Pollard as one of the best picks. Again, for the first half of the season, Tony Pollard should absolutely smash. It's a question of, is he going to give you enough late for a variety of reasons? But it's one of the reasons why you have to continue to build out structurally well early. You have to continue to make good picks once it becomes less obvious in rounds 8 through 15, because most teams at this juncture in the draft can look at their players and say, yeah, I mean, this is a good lineup that we have going here.
Shawn, we're one pick away. Is this going to be Jerry Jeudy and be a real dagger? Hawkinson nearly made it back to this one, 3 picks before, but we're about to be on the clock. I think Jerry Jeudy is a lock for us here if he makes it this one more pick. Then we have some of the younger wide receiver names in the queue, the likes of it's Aaron Jones. We can breathe a sigh of relief. So I think we can agree on Jerry Jeudy, Shawn, but then Matthew Golden, Roma Dunze, Evan Ingram goes in this area if we wanted to go tight end. I do think there'll be an advantage on this roster to double tap wide receiver here. Chris Olave goes kind of in this range if you wanted to have him in the conversation. Who do you fancy here, Shawn? I know option 1's Jerry Jeudy.
Yes, we go ahead and take Jeudy there, and we've discussed him enough. And anybody who wants to can listen to. We got some fired up Ben Gretsch going over Jerry Jeudy during the marathon. Colm, again, I want to get your guys here. Matthew Golden, we have the Packer. He's someone I don't have a ton of, but do like his situation. Adunze is a great value here, I think, but there's even maybe that more intrigue of Luther Burden. Yeah. You sort of take him out when you pick Adunze. I've come around. I think Chris Olave is an excellent selection. So for me, it's probably between Golden and Chris Olave.
Yeah, I think we'll just for fun here, I think I would lean into Matthew Golden. I've been talking about the Chris Olave side quite a bit. I know Ben's been championing him all off season long. I don't think there's any chance that he would fall to get back to us, but he is, depending on which room you're in and who you're talking to. The opinions on Olave can be quite concerned rather than optimistic around him, his quarterback situation, his health. So I do think the Matthew Golden drumbeat has just been so loud from Packers camp this offseason. I think it could have potentially even been more to it if Jordan Love had been healthy for this portion of kind of training camp, preseason, and so on. So I'm from the time of the NFL draft, and it was great the Packers took a wide receiver, and he wasn't really the wide receiver I wanted them to draft at that particular point. But based on how everything has gone over the course of the offseason, it feels like a really strong fit, and I expect the usage to be quite strong for him. So I like him there, but him and Olave are pretty close for me. And earlier this offseason, I certainly would have probably leaned there to Chris Olave. A bit like you touched on with Adunze, I would have been kind of thinking I wanted Reed, and if Reed, when he started to go later, I was happy then to let Golden go and then draft, Reed. But now we're in a situation where Reed is falling so far that he may even come into consideration for us again later on. But with Adunze, it's more I'm thinking about the potential to get Luther Burden later in the draft. So we are now up to the 4 wide receivers with Chase, Williams, Jeudy, and Golden. I like the way that looks. I think there's a certain amount of security with Williams and Golden, or Williams and Judy, and then we can see what Golden takes. The player I would have been really interested, he went in the middle of the round, obviously, so he didn't get to us. Travis Hunter would have been a real kind of upside pick that I would like to make in that range on a main event roster, but he goes that a little bit earlier. Interestingly, the Chris Olave drafter also selects him there. You mentioned you didn't draft Golden very much, Shawn. Is it more so that he's kind of going where Jerry Jeudy is going and you have to draft Jerry Jeudy, or is there any other factors that were in that, and has that changed?
No, I think the way you described it is right. That we're thinking, well, as Matthew Golden rises and Jayden Reed falls, then you can just take the veteran who has such a great profile at these, even further decreased prices. But once you find out that Jayden Reed is probably, sadly, he's probably ruined for 2025.
I mentioned on that other show that my fear now with him is he says he's going to play through it and he's not going to be 100%, but it may even get to a point where whether his production isn't strong or whether the team say, look, you're not able to produce and we're going to, put you on IR. Or that. Like, I think there's a much more stronger likelihood now that he misses time during the season, obviously, as well. And that would put Golden into being the clear wide receiver one again in that territory.
I do think that we're in a situation now, though, where Golden and Ibuka probably represent similar types of thesis. And yet they're still priced differently, even though Golden has risen.
In that scenario, though, as well, like you would have to be thinking of Romeo Doubs in the same tier as Mike Evans. Like that is not the case either.
Right. And so you think through it. I think the 49ers just seem like they're in a much better place as an organization, even with the issues that they're having with Juwan Jennings and with Brandon Ayuk, all of those different types of things. You still have the quarterback who seems like a foundation piece. A couple of years ago, an MVP candidate. He was obviously propped up a bit by the talent around him at that point. He's continued to improve and evolve, whereas the shell that the Packers went into last year and then the hand injury for Jordan Love as they're trying to get everything going, it just really spooks you that the pick that's going to be the best this season again is Josh Jacobs, which is so disheartening to think about an organization, a team as talented as the Packers sort of turtling again this season. But you have to, I think, place pretty good odds on that happening at this point, whereas the Bucks with Ibuka are going to throw, and the 49ers with Brock Purdy and George Kittle are going to throw. So that's the thing that gives me a little bit of pause. The other thing is simply that you do need to get Matthew Golden after Jerry Jeudy. And for me, even though I've been a little bit skeptical on Olave, one of the things that I've actually turned around on with the Saints is that I expect the quarterback play to be unfathomably bad, and yet a little bit Cleveland Browns-ish from last season, where Olave could be this year's Jerry Jeudy. You get a huge number of routes. You get a huge number of targets, even with bad QB play at the price that Olave is. And that's going to work out fine. If we have the Saints at the top of the NFL in dropbacks and the Packers at the bottom of the NFL in dropbacks, then it's kind of hard for this Matthew Golden play to beat Chris Olave unless Olave sustains another concussion. So that's the other reason I don't have a ton of Golden, is that I think he does have to go behind Olave for it to really make sense. And yet, I think anytime that it's someone's preference to take Golden over Olave, I can go that direction. And the flip side of it is that the Saints are going to be so bad that Olave is probably limited and probably taken out of the conversation for being a round 2 pick next year, even though Golden comes out with this very questionable prospect profile, which I also want to mention is somewhat similar for Emeka Ibuka. For Golden, when they're talking about him as being refined as a route runner, they're talking about him as being instinctive, they're talking about him as having these great hands. He's got low 4.3 speed. If all of those things come to fruition, then Matthew Golden could be going, at the 2.3 turn next year. If you want to win the whole thing, maybe that's more where you want to go with it. And just having a solid organization also gives you maybe a tiny bit more floor. You think about the first half of last year where the Browns are trotting out Deshaun Watson, And that was bad enough that it wasn't good for Jerry Jeudy. You think about some of those games with Dorian Thompson-Robinson, that was bad enough that it wasn't good for Jerry Jeudy. There may be some games this season where the Saints trot out guys where even if they threw 60 times, you're not going to get any fantasy points to your wide receivers. So, yeah, I mean, right in that range, Matthew Golden is a pretty fun play.
Then I had a little bit of Shawn, like you made both cases for the Jerry Jeudy season there for Chris Olave, the first half and the second half. Which one are we getting?
I think you're going to get a mix. That's what happens when you have as bad a quarterback play as the New Orleans Saints are like.
Yeah, and that's why I think I haven't used this phrase. I think all offseason. I feel like maybe with the Chris Olave one, when it's a best ball roster versus a managed roster, it might be more beneficial. But Olave is somebody I've drafted a lot of, and I do agree with everything that you've said there. But the one thing that kind of tipped it towards me was that other point that you made is like, which of these guys could be going at the 2-3 turn or the in the second round next year, and I feel like that would be golden based on how things would go. I also think that, like I mentioned, the Love scenario, if he was playing and we had more highlights and more clips and things like that, I think that the golden hype would have been even higher than it is based on what's happening and how they're talking about him in the camp. The one thing, Shawn, they will not stop talking about is his hand. So, I think maybe that is just like to say that the other wide receivers for the Packers last year continuously dropped the ball. Maybe they're trying to get him into such a level of confidence that he's, your hands are so good, you'll never drop the ball, just to build up his confidence. But I'm not 100% convinced as of yet, but as the wide receiver 4, I'm good to do it. But yeah, it was a close call between him and Jeudy. I think Jeudy out targets him. It depends how valuable those targets are. The other thing that has been positive from the Saints is there's been conversations around how they're going to try and use both their wide receivers this year in terms of trying to get some of those manufactured and easier completions, because Chris Olave, it has been like a kind of a career of trying to catch, very hard and maybe even uncatchable passes. So hopefully that happens for them and the Saints this year. But we are now again halfway through this following round. We've had quite a run, Shawn, of running back since we made our pick. Deebo Samuel went, Evan Ingram, Rome Odunze, Chris Olave. But after that, it was David Montgomery, David Njoku, Tyrone Tracy, JCM, Jordan Mason, Mark Andrews, Jalen Warren, Stephon Diggs, Charbonnet, Johnson, J.K. Dobbins, and Javonte Williams, along with Tucker Kraft. So a real tight end, 3 tight ends, about 8 running backs, and then 1 wide receiver in that range. A couple of names in there we would have been very interested in had they come back, particularly Zark Charbonnet, but it opens up the door for potentially some of our kind of favorite targets if they do make it back, as Keon Coleman goes off the board. Jordan Addison, Shawn, would be certainly in conversation for me here if we want to add him. Colson Loveland, after passing on Rome Odunze, could come in as a tight end option here. We start to really get into some of the kind of zero RB names at this point. Thankfully, at the start, we obviously have Jonathan Taylor and RJ Harvey, but they would obviously still become factors, but maybe not as pressing a need for us unless, those other names that I talk about go off the board here in the next couple of picks. Who are some of the names maybe that I didn't mention that you would be considering here at this point?
Well, one of the things I mentioned in this final priority targets update was the inflation, specifically as it relates to the zero RB targets. What that means for us is that when we draft at the 10-11, 9 of the zero RB candidates will be gone. And so if we go receiver here, then you're looking kind of more at bottom of the barrel running back options. That may or may not be problematic based on the bill, but you have to factor that in, because when you have the 10-12, all of these guys that go in the first half of 10, in some drafts, they will fall to you. They can bounce all over the place, but there's the risk that you will get none of them. And so there's the potential that you want to pull up. Some of the guys like Scadaboo and Tootin have done that a decent amount and feel fairly comfortable with it, since still believe those 2 specific guys are undervalued. So Jordan Addison does go 2 picks ahead of us. That means we still do have the option of going with a Colston Loveland selection. I've been drafting a lot of Michael Pittman in this area and actually moved him to a priority target. Certainly not pushing that with the receiver group that we have. But Colm, I would probably be on at least one of those two running backs and then doing anything we want on the second pick.
Yeah, those two running backs, Scadaboo the priority out of those two.
No, either way.
You're the running back guy. You tell me which one to take, and I'm open to taking both of them here. It would be both of them or one of them with Loveland for me, based on the players that are available here.
So you're comfortable going with Tootin here as well,
if that's the way that you want to go. I'm like, I like Loveland, but I'm not like have to have him now that we have Kittle, and this was kind of part of the reason. Let's do the two RBs here. I haven't got as much Tootin as I would have wanted either, so let's put the chips down. Shawn, push them to the middle of the table. We have 4 running backs now. We don't need any more running backs the rest of the draft. Isn't that right?
You can certainly play it that way. I have no problem with that. One of the reasons that I am still a little bit concerned with Loveland is that if Luther Burden does what we expect / hope / have our fingers crossed for during the second half of the season, I don't think you're going to get that much production from him early. Now, there's a chance that they have some packages for him in week 1, and just on that small sample of plays, he catches 4 balls, he breaks 5 tackles, he gets 70 yards and 2 touchdowns, and then everyone's going to be like, well, we didn't have to wait. Now, even if that happens, you're probably still going to have to wait for full Luther Burden as the season develops. But if we get him, in addition to having DJ Moore and Roma Dunze, and then you think about some of the plays that flashed for Cole Kmet in the preseason, it's not that I don't think Colson Loveland can do it. It certainly wouldn't be like a Brock Bowers type of explosion. Maybe you would get sort of a poor man's Samuel Porta. If you got something like that, it's still a massive win from the 8-9 turn. The other part of it for me, though, and you want to be aware that maybe like every time you think through a certain play that you like, you get a little bit higher on it and a little bit higher on it. Sometimes you know you're doing it. Sometimes you may not, as your brain just iterates it over and over. And every time it happens, it's a subtle shift, but it really amplifies. Basically, I want to say that Harold Fannin may not do what we're hoping, but at the prices that he goes at, I sort of just prefer having 100% Fannin and have that guy who, at the prices that he demands, would be such a magical, massive league-winning play. Even the sort of diversifying, the word I'm looking for there, early. When we have a George Kittle, I guess I want to use that pick to create some space for us to go other directions at 8-9, knowing that basically none of our running backs are going to come back, and that having both Scadaboo and Tootin, you're probably not going to get both of them to hit either. But if either of them hits, the hit should be so big that then you have a third running back who's a huge difference maker.
Yep. No, I'd agree with all that. And that was one of the reasons taking that Kittle pick over the JSN element was in my mind at that point. And if we look through, like, we could have taken Evan Ingram at the 7 turn over Matthew Golden, for example. But outside of that, we haven't really had any of the tight ends in play since the Kittle pick. So it was really Kittle or Ingram, and then we could have had Loveland there at that particular point. So I think it's worked out so far having the Kittle play, and we'll see what we do with tight end the rest of the way. You mentioned, though, Harold Fannin, Shawn, tight end 23 in FFPC ADP in the 14th round. So he has surged up quite a bit. Are you surprised, even with how enthusiastic you are about him, that like you look at Njoku tight end 8 in the 7th round? Are you surprised that he is, not necessarily closed the gap, but from where he could have been drafted earlier this offseason onto where he's been drafted now?
Well, you certainly hate to see that touchdown because it makes him a bit more expensive. Ben's talked about, the reason that touchdown doesn't really matter. You almost want to be in on those guys who flukily don't score, but you can see them beat their opponents. McMillan, an example that he always gives of that. I mean, Harold Fannin at 14-12, it's a weird deal where, Mason Taylor at 13-12 is not nearly as good a selection. And neither are a lot of the veterans, but at least that one is sort of an apples to apples type of thing. When you're looking at Isaiah Likely or Chigakonkwo, different situations. When you're looking at Brenton Strange, and Brenton Strange is sort of a arbitrage play on Tucker Kraft, then again, different situations, you may just prefer that type of play. It is a little bit surprising. I mean, on the one hand, Fannin now is ahead of Jonnu Smith. He is clearly ahead of guys like Mike Gesicki and Cade Otton. But the current price still seems to fade his actual prospect profile, which is nice. It seems to fade the combination of his prospect profile and where he was selected in the draft. And then certainly it doesn't seem to account for the buzz out of Cleveland. And then even something like being held out of a preseason game because he was one of the priority guys where they want to get him into the season. It does seem like Njoku is probably going too early when you think about what Fannin could give. It is something where it makes it seem like Cedric Tillman is probably going too early. But I think the other part of it where I view things differently, and again, anytime that you are out of sync with the rest of the community, you have this very strong potential to simply be wrong. But I guess I'm more optimistic and more enthusiastic about Cleveland's ability to move the ball and potentially even score points, but certainly move the ball maybe than what the community is, because Jerry Jeudy's price and Harold Fannin's price don't seem to indicate an average offense in terms of moving the ball, which I think that the Cleveland Browns I'm tempted to say clearly, but that kind of, cuts back against my statement where I'm probably wrong. I think they're going to move the ball, basically, is the case. And if that is true, those guys are undervalued.
Yeah. I think, I just think it's interesting that kind of squeeze up an ADP from where he was. It's tricky, Shawn. It's like the players that you like, you kind of want them to not be doing great so you can get a great ADP on them. But then you're also like, this isn't working out the way we hoped. So that's why they're down there. So it's that kind of a balance. You want them to be good enough, their ADP just stays steady, but it's still at a discounted price. Josh Downs and Ollie Garden, just after being selected, again, we're about 8 picks away from it coming back. You mentioned, Shawn, the 0RB names, some of them that haven't been drafted yet, Jaden Blue, Trey Benson, Dylan Sampson, so they could potentially come into conversation, but there is a number of picks to go before it would get back to us. Players then at the wide receiver position that would be interesting, I think, to put in the mix would be Luther Burden, who we talked about potentially picking when we passed on Roma Dunze. You would also have Jaden Higgins as a potential option. I do think that if you filled out this wide receiver core with 2 more wide receivers, or even one with one of those running backs in this area, would be advantageous as you build out the roster. I see you have added in some of the potential QB options at this turn. How have you been finding these drafts with the quarterback position? Are you trying to get one of these guys, the likes of a Bo Nix or Kyler Murray, or are you trying to push it on? I feel like it, obviously for me, if the names that we touched on that are NRQ are still there when it gets to this pick, I'd be more likely to go non-quarterback. But how are you feeling that Baker Mayfield did just get selected, but how are you playing quarterback in general in this format when you haven't taken one of the elite guys?
Yeah, it's interesting that Bo Nix goes so far ahead of Baker Mayfield. That's probably right, but it still is fascinating to see the prices evolve, to see how the thinking about these guys evolves. I don't know that you're going to get that big of a gap between Nix and Mayfield from a rushing perspective. And if you don't, then it is interesting that Nix is so much more expensive. And I'm
in this draft, he's
because
obviously not going to be more expensive, but at the moment you're at a round discount on Nix versus ADP. So if he gets to us, it'll be a round and a half. So you would have to consider him then.
One of the things that I would note is that you can't rely on it for any particular guy. So if you have a player who's a must-have, you go ahead and draft him at QB, but someone out of the group that's compelling has fallen in basically every draft that I've done to where you get them multiple rounds below where they normally go. That maybe doesn't even do that much for you in terms of saying, oh, I got this great ADP value at QB. But what it does allow you to do is execute your tactics or execute your priority player selections on other guys before you get to that QB. And so from that perspective, if you can push the QB beyond this 10-11, where the 10-11, and then you think about it from some other picks, where like into the mid-11, there are usually some good players that could have a very meaningful difference in terms of the quality of your roster at midseason, certainly at playoff time, then pushing the QB beyond that spot usually really, really helps you. The thing here is just that if we got a 2-round discount on Bo Nix and he hits the upper end of his outcomes, then you get a situation where you actually got an impact QB at a much lower price than the drafters who are paying for those truly elite QBs in that 3-4 round range.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I have a feeling here that Nix is going to go before it gets to us in 5 picks time, but I do think that with the discount, we would have to strongly consider him even with those other options available. The likelihood is if he makes it to us, those other options, some of those would have disappeared off the board in the end term here with these 4 picks. So we'll see what happens to us. Christian Kirk goes off the board, ahead of, he does go ahead of Jaden Higgins, but I think I would much rather select Jaden Higgins outright between the two of them, although I will admit in the past I was a Christian Kirk truther at one point. When we see what it plays out, you mentioned the other quarterback option, Shawn, and how you could play it out. Like there's a lot of options, going in that 14-15 range that are very intriguing as well to me. So if it isn't Nix, I think I would probably push it around the corner. Now, Shawn's prophecy is coming to light here. Jaden Blue, Dylan Sampson, back-to-back picks after going off the board. One more pick before we are on the clock. So then we'll have to have a little bit of a conversation around this particular pick and who it could be. Sean Judkins and Dylan Sampson back-to-back in the 10th round. So both of those guys will be interesting to see how it plays out over the course of the season. So Shawn, we're up on the clock here. I'm pretty good if we take one of the wide receivers and then we can have a conversation. Is between Borden and Higgins, are you much stronger on Borden between the two?
I think I am.
I think it makes sense between the two of them.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and click Borden there.
Based on basically what we talked about earlier and that we passed on 2 of the Bears options to try and get Borden.
Yeah, when you pass the Dunze and you pass Loveland specifically to take Burden, you do kind of want to go ahead and take
not pass him as well.
There. I'm split on this. I think the quarterbacks, including good quarterbacks, are going to fall. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't still take one of them later. So you have that option with a Bo Nix that gives you even more chance to outperform at QB. We don't need the Higgins selection here.
No, we don't need him. And I do think based on the discount, the next pick would make sense. And we have him with Harvey potentially as well. I know that's not going to be a case that he's always throwing passing touchdowns to Harvey, but it also adds a tie-breaking or splitting element between the two of them. So again, you'll be hoping that Nix takes a step forward in year 2, and then that shows his growth and development, and then he actually outperforms what he did last year. And Shawn, I can't remember specifically, I don't know if you can remember off the top of your head, but Bo Nix's ADP this time last year, I'm sure it wasn't the 20th round where we were drafting him. We were drafting him a lot last year, but I feel like now at the 11:01, that's a really fair value, even factoring in his upside. When it is in the 9th round, for example, where he's going, I feel like I want those other names. Like you referenced, we talked about Tootin, then those guys that have just gone in blue, and Sampson, Trey Benson, Braylon Allen, all those kind of guys, Josh Downs, Michael Pittman, who you referenced. I kind of want all of them before I go to the QB. And we often talk about if an area gets flat and the quarterback really stands out as the clear pick, I feel like that's what kind of happened there with Nix. If we were saying, well, we take him in the 9th round, I would have been passing on him at the actual ADP.
And yeah, I'm not even gonna say it, but
go on, say it, whatever it was.
There was a QB that I really wanted last year, but I didn't want him in every draft. And then he kept falling in every draft. And so I got a lot of them in Colm. It did not work out. But
was it Gardner Minshew? No. Was it?
Did you just come through with Gardner Minshew?
Yeah, was it? No.
No.
I drafted a lot of Aidan O'Connell last year, Shawn. So I know how you can feel if the QB play doesn't work out that you go for.
And so Colm obviously referring to our Superflex tournaments when he's bringing up those names. Yeah. I think I went through this before on the show, Colm, but it is weird and really uncomfortable and yet also pretty fun that as a Kansas City Chiefs fan, the team that you always hated, just absolutely hated growing up with the Denver Broncos. You had those John Elway teams that went to the Super Bowl. Then later you had, and I mean, John Elway would always beat you on the final drive, which, more for the Cleveland Browns than maybe the Chiefs, but he would always beat you. Even if they got embarrassed in the Super Bowl, teams from the AFC West, teams from the AFC were horrified of John Elway. Then more recently, obviously, you had the Peyton Manning second act, where he had a couple of all-time great seasons there in Denver, and they win a Super Bowl with him. I've got many memories, or not many, but a couple of key memories of being at Arrowhead Stadium during the Dick Vermeil years, where they had the unstoppable offense with Priest Holmes and Trent Green. You'd be up multiple touchdowns in the fourth quarter. You're like, here come the Broncos. Not even necessarily so much because of the Broncos, but because that Kansas City Chiefs defense was the worst of all time. I mean, last year, Cincinnati Bengals defense, I mean, if they were going to, look over their shoulder or look side by side with the Kansas City Chiefs of that era, they'd be like, yeah, I mean, we weren't good, but we weren't these guys. So some games there where the Broncos came from 2 touchdowns back in the fourth quarter to win. All of those memories, all of that rivalry, and yet it's been a while since I've been as all in on a team as I am on the 2025 Denver Broncos. And Colm, I mean, Bo Nix keeps coming to us, 2.5 rounds below ADP. I was sort of checking. He's been going the last 3 days at 812. If you take out the big gorillas, he's going 904. The main events will often feature drafters really playing chicken at the quarterback. Now, I say that, but 9 of the 12 teams do have QBs at this point. The 3 teams that have waited are going to get, fairly similar picks to the Patrick Mahomes, Baker Mayfield, Bo Nix drafters at, big discounts. One of the things that you are gambling on yourself when you go ahead and make that pick of a QB is that if it does cost you something, you'll be able to outdraft the rest of the room from that point on to where hopefully it just works out anyway. Now, having the QB pick work out is also something that would be fantastic if we can get that. There are pathways where the Broncos could be good, but Bo Nix doesn't score.
The other thing with the QB picks is I think when you're talking relative to the discount that we're going to get on Bo Nix and how we feel about what Bo Nix could be in 2025, I think a lot of these other QB, people probably will take them in the region of ADP rather than get some extreme discount. They may get them half a round after. We'll see how they start to pick up here on the quarterback position as we finish up around 11, head into round 12. Shawn, I just want to highlight again, Team 8. They have a beautiful, draft board here so far. Started the 5 wide receivers. They followed it up then with DeAndre Swift, Tyrone Tracy, J.K. Dobbins, Braylon Allen, Trey Benson, Brian Robinson. So started with 5 running backs, or 5 wide receivers. They come back, they hammer 6 running backs. It's a very aesthetically pleasing draft board, Shawn, I must say. I don't think I've ever seen one get through 11 rounds with such a kind of I'm trying to think of the word, symmetrical. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's nice. It looks nice there. Very organized. Yeah,
the 5 previous running back selections are so strong that you wonder a bit why they would draft Brian Robinson as opposed to taking Jaden Higgins, who did fall to them. Jaden Higgins ends up going at the 1109. The other element here, and I'm not saying that we have this crushed necessarily, because again, there are paths the Broncos could take that don't actually end up in a lot of points for Bo Nix. But 2025, at least right now, looks like a year where maximizing the starting lineup will be important. this team is going to have relatively little at the tight end position. They're going to, probably be fine at QB, but still lose some points there. The hope that they will have is that with these selections they've made so far, that they will certainly dominate wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2. They will dominate, or at least do well at running back 1 and running back 2. And then you're expecting to dominate the flex with JSN and Worthy, or Worthy and Abuka. If you get these running backs to break in your favor, maybe you're even dominating the flex with Braylon Allen and Trey Benson. The problem just, again, comes in that you arguably have too much depth at those positions. You're going to have guys on the bench early on. And in some years, that was completely the way to play it. And if we have an avalanche of injuries in 2025, it may be the way to play it again. You're just giving up some spots that this year, you want to have. You want to have that full starting lineup. And with the sprint, and I say sprint in this case, I shouldn't be mixing the terminology around, with how quickly we get through the first 12 weeks. A type of team that uses chaos not only at running back and wide receiver, but also uses it at the onesies to try and get to where you're balancing out what other teams have by the playoffs. It's hard for that type of structure to make it, right? The part that people have stopped focusing on enough in 2025, and you get this with things like the Rashee Rice picks. Certainly, I think skeptics of our willingness to take a Jordan Addison, you still have to make it. And there are ways that you can approach your draft to meaningfully impact that advance rate. And again, if you can do that, and then you're also confident in your player selections, to have a good advance rate, and then within that group to have some super teams because you were a good player selector, that's probably the way to do it. Or at least to attempt it this year.
Yeah, interesting. I was going to mention, Kenny, when you were talking there about the Ray Rice pick and the starting lineup element, team 3 in this draft, overall, good player selection. Gibbs, Irvin, Higgins, Pickens, Hurts, Rice, Ingram, Addison, Jake Ferguson, Dylan Sampson, and then Keenan Allen. But looking at how you're looking at in a 12 weeks run here to try and get through, and the wide receiver 3 and the wide receiver 4, one of them is going to be missing 6 games, one of them is going to be missing 3 games. Now, I would have drafted Jordan Addison on this roster if he had got back when we were talking about the Scatterbo Tootin pick at the 8-9, goes 2 picks before that. But he would have been our wide receiver 5 at that particular point. So essentially on this roster then, Keenan Allen becomes your wide receiver 3 if you're starting 3 wide receivers. And it obviously can work out. Allen could, have sufficient work those weeks. But it really leaves you thin. I'm very surprised. I feel like in this here particular contest with the 12-week element, that Ray Rice almost becomes undraftable in this situation. He's drafted in the 6th round here, and then Jordan Addison gets drafted in the 8th round, where I think that's where he should go. But I think that you could be giving yourself some issues problematically for your roster. When I'm looking at that now, I'm thinking, I hope we get drawn against Team 3 in the opening 3 weeks because they're down 2 wide receivers.
Yeah, and the way that they have it set up, they will be able to play Jake Ferguson and Dylan Sampson in the 2 flex spots. That could work if you're a big Jake Ferguson fan and you're thinking he also will benefit from the Cowboys' likely approach in addition to a CeeDee Lamb, in addition to a George Pickens. That's fine. And if you get fortunate, right, and he hits a couple of times, so you get some yardage and you get a touchdown or 2, then that potentially could really work. If Dylan Sampson does what I sort of think he will do, then potentially that could work. They also have a Keenan Allen. There's certainly a scenario where Keenan Allen is 5 rounds undervalued, in which case, again, you have it kind of covered in an interesting way. So I'm not saying that it won't work, but the shortness of the tournament, you're going to have the player out during that bye week as well as the suspension weeks. It starts to become pretty tricky, especially when either of those players, Addison and Rice, might not be that viable the first week they return either, as teams have to shift around their game planning, work the players back into the mix, all of that. If you get them through, you're looking at a very exciting roster. But Colm, we say that, I mean, are we guaranteed that Rashee Rice is going to be better than Jerry Jeudy? Are you guaranteed that Jordan Addison is going to be better than, say, a Michael Pittman who goes after him? When you think about how maybe the gap over other players in the same range is not that great, or not as big as we think in the upside. So when you're taking a guy to stash, you're also thinking he's going to hit like on a 90th percentile outcome when he comes back.
Yeah.
And that part of it, yeah, it can definitely work. You want as many good players on your roster as possible. I have usually taken the approach of stashing a player who has fallen for some type of reason and then assumed that I could cover that. I would refer to the results as mixed in that it definitely does work some. But occasionally when you go back and look at it, you're like, I'm a good enough selector, or I have to believe that in order to make it make sense to continue to do this process at all. That if I had just picked my favorite healthy player there, I also would have come out in pretty good shape. Colm, we're back. 12-12, 13-01. This is an odd area of the draft where it's not particularly good. I do kind of like a Keaton Mitchell.
Oh, you're ready. Oh, you got it.
Right
I was going to give the pitch. It was Harold Fannin's not going to get back to us in the next round. If we want to take him, this is the time to take him. I was going to have a conversation around him and Chigakonkwo, because he would have been more at the ADP play. So we have Will Shipley, Keaton Mitchell, Harold Fannin. Oh, Shawn doesn't even let Harold Fannin make it to the 13th round. He takes him at the 12-12, so bumping up that ADP a little bit more, Shawn. I think Keaton Mitchell is the upside play here between the two of them. Have you a preference between Shipley and Mitchell?
I like Mitchell. I think that he's going to have more standalone value than Will Shipley, and that could become very important as you go through these buys. When you look at our team that has Cam Scadaboo and Bashal Tutin, if they both start out very slowly, which is certainly very possible, then you want to have another guy in there who does actually have some standalone value. To have the standalone value, because, and part of the thesis for standalone value is that he's probably going to catch some passes. Justice Hill was very good in that role last season. You look back at some of the previous years where they've overlapped a little bit, or specifically the time when they overlapped when Keaton Mitchell was a rookie, he appeared to be taking the receiving value away from Justice Hill at that time. The coaches talking about Mitchell this training camp were emphasizing how valuable he can be specifically in the passing game. They're really emphasizing all parts of it. They're like, he's small, but he can run up the middle, right? You can't be this guy who just bounces everything. You got to be able to take it through the line and then go. He can do that. Obviously, he's one of the few players in the NFL who can get to the outside every once in a while. And maybe a little bit more back in the Kansas City Chiefs days, the Dolphins have used Tyreek Hill pretty well vertically, but you would occasionally get these sort of flare passes or screen passes to Tyreek Hill with Kansas City, where he would then have this ability to run around the defender, get to the edge, and take it for another 10 yards that just no one else has, right? It's the thing they tell you not to do because you're just going to lose yardage. You can't run around NFL defenders. I mean, Tyreek Hill was that guy who was athletic enough to do it. Keaton Mitchell also has that, right? He's one of the few running backs who can legitimately beat anyone anywhere. That element, I think, makes him a player where the standalone value, it's going to be minimal. You'd certainly prefer to play someone else, but it's there. And then the upside is absolutely massive.
The other thing, Shawn, with a player like him is like, there's going to be some of these rosters, say in more in best ball formats, where we have gone 0 RB and Cam Scadaboo and Tutin, maybe our first two running backs. And then you're adding Mitchell and you're like, well, we're hoping that, we get two of these guys having points in these opening weeks of the season. But when you have Jonathan Taylor and RJ Harvey, and then he's your running back 5, I think that's just an insane upside spot. And at the 13-01, Shawn, I'll say, rather than the 12-12. We talked enough about Harold Fannin earlier. The one thing I will highlight is we talked about the QBs. We took Bo Nix. There was a run between that and our next pick off 5 QBs. They all went in the 12th round. Interestingly enough, though, Kyler Murray was kind of one of the names. He would be in that Bo Nix, Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray kind of where they go in ADP. He does drop by kind of 2 rounds in ADP. The last one before we got kind of squared up at QB 14, QB14 went off the board right at where QB14 goes off the board, but it was in a different order, and it was Brock Purdy who has been going kind of at the 11-12. He went in this draft at the 13-02, so he falls again. He's somebody I've noticed that falls in some drafts, and he was one of the names that if we'd have passed on Bo Nix that I would have kind of had in consideration, but I really like the way it played out to allow us to get Fannin and Mitchell as well on the roster. I really like that 4-pick run that we've got there with Burden, Nix, Fannin, and Mitchell, along with, like, I think that the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, those turns have worked out pretty perfect so far. So hopefully the trend continues for the rest of the draft. As we see the Denver defense go off the board, you do have to draft a kicker out of defense in this format. Shawn, unless it gets really flat, are we kind of looking the last 2 rounds in the majority of the cases for kicker and defense, or is there any kickers and defense that you're willing to try and get on your roster at ADP, or is it a case of always just beyond ADP?
Denver came back to us at 1409 recently and did pull the trigger once there. You got to be a little bit careful about going for the elite defenses, because one of your problems is that they occasionally then do hit good offenses, and you'd still prefer just to stream someone against a weaker offense. Now you're starting to use more roster spots than you can really afford at that position. And, you spent up, you had potentially some opportunity cost, and then you end up causing yourself more roster management problems later. Now, that's still going to be the case with Denver, but at least they do hit 2 bad teams to start, which is pretty fun. Maybe you have 2 big performances right off the bat. One of the things that has made picking any other defenses than just the teams that play, the 4 teams that play early, where you might get to watch them and then put them in and out. And I think that even though you look at those 4 teams, probably Philadelphia is the only one where you're really thinking like this could work, and maybe none of them are that great for it. Probably the Chiefs and the Chargers are unappealing in that should be a relatively well-played game, even though it's early. But the impact of special teams in 2025 is a real wild card to get us in this mindset where just having a chance to see an additional team. The defensive scoring is going to bounce around so wildly. You get to see an additional game, play it or not play it. That part could be very helpful to you. There are some teams that aren't being drafted, like the New York Jets, where I think, if you don't get that performance that you're looking for on Thursday or Friday night, then you just come back in with a decent little defense and you start your streaming process right from week 1. It's always interesting to see where Brandon Aubrey goes. He has such a strong track record at this point for kicking a lot of field goals, but certainly the long field goals. It could be a situation where their offense is better this season and scores more touchdowns. And so maybe you don't have that massive flurry of 50-plus yard field goals. But kicker was pretty helpful to us in 2025. We had some good stretches where either Aubrey or Cameron Dicker or Chris Boswell put up a ton of points. I'm not saying that you're going to be able to count on that every year. Some of the times when you get hot and your scoring is probably just lucky. But I also don't want to completely ignore that position, given that it's a position that scores. It's in your starting lineup. Whereas a lot of these picks that we're looking at here are rarely, if ever, going to be in your starting lineup. The kicker is going to be there every week. So if we have an exploitable opportunity, or if there's something that comes up, certainly, you would look at a Harrison Butker and say that pick works. It's also a pick that has a Thursday or Friday night game. Jake Elliott usually goes very late. That's kind of a fun one because you don't even have to spend up for one of the kickers on a very good offense that also plays early. Those are the main things we're looking at here. And then Colm, that I'm pretty infatuated with Cam Little. And so anytime you're on the clock and don't know who to pick, just go ahead and pick that guy.
Just draft Cam Little, and we'll see. Aubrey, he's at the top of the ADP queue at the moment. We are 9 to 10 picks, 9 picks away from when we'll be selecting. So he probably goes in this range, but maybe if he makes it back to a Shawn, that would mean that some players, obviously there's a lot of players below him that would have to go off the board. This is an area where a lot of the QBs, when they're not drafted, start to pile up on top of each other. ADP wise, you're looking at Goff, McCarthy, Herbert, Josh Palmer, Demario Douglas, Trevor Lawrence, Xavier Legette, Rico Dowdle, CJ Stroud, Jordan Love, Chris Rodriguez, Wendell Robinson. That's getting down through where you're starting to have to scroll down the list, and then you get into some deep Baltimore defense, DJ Giddens, Blake Corum, Adam Thielen. So you're starting to get into a point, Shawn, where it's like kicker defense and get your guys. So at the moment, if we look at it, we are in the 14th round as we're picking. We have 7 selections left to make. 2 of those obviously being kicker and defense. We have 5 non-kicker and defense picks to run through as we go through the rest of the draft. We have 1 QB, 5 running backs, 5 wide receivers, 2 tight ends. I think we're really set up here in a position where we can kind of go in any direction. We could potentially even add in some of those Broncos, like a Troy Palmer for the Broncos wide receivers to go with Bo Nix. When you take a Nix there, like, I feel quite comfortable, moving on and not taking another QB after taking Nix. Are you looking to take it? I know you often like to have that sneak peek at some of these quarterbacks, and we've even drafted 4 QBs in the main event. Are you looking to have some sneak peeks at the end of the, when we're into that 19th or 20th round, if they're available? Or are you thinking like you could just like load up this roster in other positions and see what we do? Bo Nix is a week 12 bye, so if we're getting him to have QB 8 or above production, we're probably not pulling him out of that starting lineup early in the season.
Yeah, but I think about the situation last year with CJ Stroud, where on the teams where I did take a second QB and that second QB hit, those teams perform better than the ones who didn't for some fairly obvious reasons. And so I want to make sure we remain somewhat aware of the possibility of Nix simply being good and not great. In which case, if you took a look at a JJ McCarthy for a couple of weeks and had a chance to determine, like, is this team going to catch fire once they get Jordan Addison back? Are they going to be one of the 3 or 4 highest scoring teams in the NFL? That is interesting. Certainly the same thing with Jared Goff. He's not going to give you anything as a runner, but if they successfully unlock a little bit more vertical passing and they're averaging 50 points a game, and I mean, I'll say averaging, you come out, and again, you think back to that 2013 season with Peyton Manning and how that team scored and what it meant. Jared Goff is not Peyton Manning, but the players around him, the scoring environment in that division, it could be so exciting. If you get a 50-point game from the team early, if you have Jameson Williams going off, you have that connection of the 2 guys together, I think that part is somewhat compelling. And we look at his price, in early 14, maybe he even comes back to you at the 16 turn. It's probably Goff and McCarthy who are the interesting guys from this point.
The trouble is, Shawn, we're on the clock, and they are the next 2, QBs here that are up in front of us. Are you willing to push it to 16, 17, or have you names here that you're looking at, or are you actually thinking about one of those QBs?
So even though the ADP continues to be low, which has not been the case in the leagues I've actually been in, I do think that probably one of these picks should be Troy Franklin. And then beyond that, if you want to take one of Taj Brooks and Brashard Smith to have that opportunity, then you probably need to take them here. If you do that, then you don't get the QB. You say that maybe you don't need those guys on every team, take them on some teams, also take some secondary quarterbacks so you have those paths through as well. Colm,
let's take Franklin first anyway. I'll give us some more time to talk through, because he was somebody I was thinking of trying to get on the roster. So then by running back, I'm looking at Brooks, Smith, or Hunter. Now Hunter is a much later ADP than the other 2 guys, so we probably don't have to take him. He's generally going in the 17th, so he should come back into play for us here. Smith will be gone before it would come back to us, obviously. The other part that I would look at is I think that there's a chance that Sanders gets back to us. He goes right at this 16-12. So I'd be willing now that we have 2 tight ends to risk the Sanders pick coming back. So I feel like it's QB or running back here, Shawn. Which way do you want to play it? I think he takes Brashard Smith.
Were you about to say the opposite?
No, well, what I was going to say is we are pretty in a really strong position at the running back position if we wanted to go QB. But I also, before we got to the turn and you made those points, I was willing to continue to push the quarterback position.
And one of the things that we do see here is that the teams that waited, 2 of them now have 2 quarterbacks. One of the teams that waited has Drake May, and may consider that to be similar to an elite QB. We do have the team that took Lamar Jackson, also came back and got Dak Prescott. So I'm certainly not saying that teams will wait on the QB2 position, but in any of these rooms, you have the potential that basically everyone who got an elite QB will wait and will push, and that some of them will just take 1 QB. You don't need to take a second quarterback in this. You can watch for a couple of weeks. You can see who's still available. You can bid $10 on them. You can bid 2 on them. You might be in a situation where they play well enough after week 1 that you're like, okay, it does somewhat affect our ability to bid aggressively on subsequent players, but maybe we even want to bet 118 or something like that, and you get over some folks, and maybe you add a Bryce Young or you add a Cam Ward if it looks like they're going to have a big season. The reason I went ahead and clicked on Smith, I agree with you, he's probably not going to come back. He's also in this situation where he's still very much a black box for us. The Chiefs are trying to talk up Isaiah Pacheco. They're trying to talk up Kareem Hunt. But there's that possibility. I mean, there's even the possibility that Brashard Smith is involved in a special teams play and then maybe a couple of short touchdowns. He's going to have a bit of that Jerick McKinnon role. They don't have a lot at the receiving position with the Rice suspension and then having the Royals injury on top of that. And so a back who you get the impression that they're using almost as much as a receiver could have that early role, could score some in a way that you might be tempted to put him in the lineup. Now, you probably are going to need to get like 17 points or something like that in order to bench some of the really exciting guys for week 1. But the flexibility that you get by drafting Smith with the idea that we could cut him even before the season starts, there will be a few players that we debate and that we want who go undrafted. Being able to look at Smith and then pivot to a player we really wanted who didn't get drafted at all, that's another benefit of taking that approach with him right there.
The other thing I mentioned, Shawn, I don't know if it's like me. I talk and mention Javonte Sanders a lot. I don't see a huge amount of buzz elsewhere, but consistently in any draft that we're in, he goes early. I have to say, one of my favorite things this offseason has been my anguish when I don't get to draft Jatavion Sanders, but then like when the podcast comes out, probably like 30 minutes after it, somebody will message and say like, oh, that was me, I'm team 3. I took Jatavion Sanders. So I'm really enjoying, like, most of my email interaction with listeners has been like people telling me that they drafted Jatavion Sanders when we were in the same room. So that is has been a lot of fun. So Herbert goes. The reason, Shawn, I was okay with passing a quarterback, you mentioned Goff, you mentioned McCarthy, and I like both of those as targets. But like, CJ Stroud, who you mentioned being kind of a thorn in your side last season at points, but he hasn't gone. Jordan Love hasn't gone. Like, there's a lot of QB options at the time we took that pick. Justin Herbert hadn't gone. So I would be astonished if none of them come back to us at this 16 turn. Makes it a better play to do what we did there. And now the other questions, kind of overall strategy with the remaining picks that we have left. We have 5 picks to make. So we have 3 non-kicker DST selections to go with. We have 2 tight ends, probably depends on what the options. Like if Sanders was there, he would have been an option, but Pat Firemouth, some other options will be here at the 16-17 turn. Are you looking to get up to a 3rd or 4th tight end? And then are you I think we're pretty, the problem is that the best picks may end up being at running back. We have 6 running backs, and I'm very comfortable with that room. We have some lit wide receivers that we like. We might take a second QB as we've kind of talked through. Is there any elements of the team that you're really prioritizing now over these last couple of rounds? Is it just that we're it feels like we have the freedom to go in whichever direction that we want for these last rounds now? And hopefully, going back to our conversation at the start, hopefully we can nail the landing here, Shawn.
Yeah, no, this roster is set up with a ton of flexibility as we continue to move through the drafts. You had mentioned feeling stung when Sanders goes. his ADP is at 1701. And so he is picked almost 2 rounds early. Now, we know that obviously the player selection and prices are going to bounce around a ton. Once you're into this area of the draft, you have to get the people that you want. You can't rely on them to come back. You talked about that tight end situation. Having Fannin behind Kittle is not a ton of protection if we should need someone for a multi-week stretch somewhat early in the season. The guy who goes late and sometimes doesn't even go at all, who seems like he could have 10 targets in week 1, is Pat Freiermuth. So I'm always okay selecting him. Colm, he was someone that you and I cut off of our dynasty team to get down to 20. Ben and I cut him off of a team as well. And so even in a situation where I think we're Pat Freiermuth enthusiasts, sometimes you have to go in a different direction because
he's somebody I could see us like rushing to try and, you know, if we had like a trade that we could move a player for a pick, I think like he would be a priority pickup for us, you know, off waivers. But just the way the rosters are set up, it went into that range. But I would be very open. Interestingly, him and Jatavion Sanders are kind of going back-to-back picks and recent ADP. So if he came back to us at that turn, I would be interested in him. When we look through the other names with Shawn, there isn't like, you know, Mike Gesicki, Cade Otton, Theo Johnson has already gone. He's somebody who goes in the 17th round in general. Darren Waller, Johnny Smith has gone as well in the 13th round. Just looking at ADP, quite a few of these tight ends have been pulled up ahead of ADP. I suppose, Shawn, we could be to blame for that. We took Harold Fannin up a little bit as well, and then we've kind of kickstarted an effect after that where people have pulled up some of those names. When we looked at, we got Trey Franklin, who was a priority for us, particularly on this roster as well, where we have the next selection. There's not like with Coker picking up the injury and missing the kind of first 4 to 6 weeks, that kind of takes him out of some of your targets here. Who are we? Sprinkle in some of your late round names here that we should be considering. I guess we could also we could double tap here if it gets back to it with Freiermuth and Hunter, if that's the way that we wanted to play it as well.
Yeah, so many options late in drafts, which is one of the reasons why if you have a pick, go ahead and reach for them, get that guy on your roster, and then come back and make other selections that you wanted to make anyway. As I'm looking at this turn developing Colm, one of the things that I'm seeing, because he is the second kicker by ADP, because the Chargers are expected to score a lot, because the game goes early, Cameron Dicker goes very early, and I've never picked him in part because I've never in a position where it made sense to take him. He would be kind of an interesting pick at the 16-17 turn. The Philadelphia Eagles defense is an interesting pick at the 16-17 turn. We could draft both of those guys saying, look, we're going to have guys at 18, 19, and 20 that we're excited about. Why not do this kicker and defense attack? At the same time, I'm always interested in what my draft partners are thinking when it comes to the Troy Franklin and Pat Bryant thing together. You can put them together and then watch for a bit, cut the guy who is not the player. Working. Yeah, see who's working. Then you probably are going to end up with an impact player with that selection. Now, you're also going to maybe burn a pick. The best case would just be hitting on them and then getting, someone else. But you're going to mix them across rosters, right? So in the roster that you don't select the guy who hits, that's a burn pick anyway, right? So we want to make sure we're thinking about it that way as well. JJ McCarthy is still here. Jarquez Hunter is someone who could fall back to us at the 18-19 turn. And then you were mentioning some of those receivers. Malik Washington, someone we're trying to get almost everywhere. Trey Harris is an interesting name based on his draft slot and the fact that they play early. It doesn't really seem like things are setting up for him to have a big opening game. So that pushes him back down a little bit. But we could easily go Trey Harris, Pat Bryant with these two picks. I think there's just so much flexibility to do things that are fun here. One of which will not include drafting Malik Washington. He goes at 1609.
Yeah, he goes just as you kind of mentioned his name. I am intrigued, Shawn, at the Cameron Dicker potential pick here. One thing that I do like in these situations is, and I guess now in the next two picks, when I'm saying this, he's going to get drafted, but it allows you to like everything you said there, but it allows you to also have somebody that you're like confident you're not going to be running through and swapping out in those early weeks of the season. He also is a week 12 bye. Obviously, you can see how the team is doing in general, but there's a lot to kind of like about potentially having somebody locked in as the kicker that's going to be there for the whole season. Now, he does go in the 17th round, but he's going to go between when we make these two picks and when it comes back to us. So he is in play here. We are up on the clock, Shawn. We have all those options we talked about. Based on how we are set up at running back, I don't think that we have to prioritize Hunter here. I also don't think we have to really prioritize Bryant or the QB. So do you want to take Hunter at this pick, or do you want to, like, because we do have a lot of other options, do you want to push, not Hunter, sorry, Decker? Do you want to take Decker at this pick, and then do you want to take the kicker?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's get our guy from a year ago, and then yeah, this is tough. I mean, McCarthy here is such a compelling stash. I think having Bryant and getting the better of the two Broncos guys after we see a couple weeks, that's really hard to pass on.
Well, I think if we're looking at trying to have the two of them to see which one, because I'm not sold that we have to have like McCarthy over Stroud or Love. Unless you feel strongly about that. Okay.
Yeah, so we take Pat Bryant there.
Like, I feel like you can only see which one's better if you take both of them. You can't you can see which one's better if you draft none of them either. Just watch the games. But I think that gives you, like, the other thing, Shawn, when you're looking at this, you do have the possibility that, let's say, Mims just continues in his kind of little bit more of a manufacturer touches gadget role, and we don't want anyone to get hurt, but something happens to Sutton. Like, there's a chance that both of those guys could be strong plays as well, or they could, you could be keeping them throughout the season, and both of them have impacts at certain points. The problem is you're going to have to pick which one you're starting. But I think that we would want to try that. I think there's a good reason for doing it at their cost, along with having the QB on the roster as well. And I just I like McCarthy, and we would have been getting a full two round discount on him as well as we did on Bo Nix. But again, I think that we can take those other QBs if one of them came to us. Interestingly, there is a team that did wait and took Justin Fields. They now are up to 3 quarterbacks. They took Herbert and Penix as well. But pretty much everybody, Shawn, is now set up with, obviously everyone has one QB, but when we look through it, the majority of the teams have kind of half and half up to 2. So we'll see how that plays out. But like it in the kicker there, I'm much more optimistic about streaming defense week to week than I am. It's good to have a locked in kicker. So we'll see now what we do at the next turn. But I do feel like McCarthy, Stroud, or Love, or even, I didn't even mention his name, but Bryce Young could get back to us. We didn't talk about Pat Freiermuth at that turn. This is the range that he goes. If he came back to us in the next round, I think would be fantastic. I mentioned this is the range he goes, Shawn. I may have miscalculated that. On my ADP, it's showing 1701. What are you seeing for Pat Freiermuth in the last couple of days?
Yeah, so selected for the time period of August 28th through today, and looking at Big Gorilla and main events, I'm seeing him at 1802.
Okay.
So definitely a possibility. Like I said, on one of the drafts I did recently, he was
big difference, Shawn, when you add the Big Gorilla versus the main event. If you just go main event only from the 30th, that's where I had it filtered from, is the 1701. But when you do the same dates and put in the Big Gorilla, it does push him way down. So Big Gorilla drafters not as fond of Pat Freiermuth. Hopefully we have a room of Big Gorilla drafters here in the main event today.
Colm, it's always fun. I want to ask you a bit about our dynasty trades, our dynasty cuts. I had some fascinating experiences, got lots of good trades to get down. We talk about, a lot of folks think, how are you going to use the players? If you have 30 guys, you've got to get rid of 10 of them. The bottom 3 or 4 guys you can just cut. Now, those guys will actually be pretty interesting too, but you'd have to cut somebody. And so you're okay with that. You can move, 5 to 6 players in a variety of trades. A lot of the trades that we executed work pretty well. You get kind of what you're looking for. The trades are more or less fair. It's always interesting, the psychology of it. And I don't think this is going to surprise anybody, but when I get really lopsided trades that seem like they're basically saying, you're going to have to cut people, so give me people for free, those I always reject. I will occasionally send pretty unbalanced trades out because I'm trying to accomplish a specific thing tactically, get a player, and that portion of the trade where I'm sending it, I'm more okay with this idea of, yes, I'm giving you a value because I want you to work with me on this and give me the guy that I want, and knowing that I'm going to have to overpay at that time of the season, A, because it's that time of the season, and B, you always have to overpay to make sure you get the player you want, because that player's on that team for a reason, because they thought that guy was better than the overall community. 8 times out of 10, that's the case. Otherwise, the player would simply be on someone else's roster in the first place. There were a few humorous ones where I wasn't able to make trades with DeAndre Swift very well. I wasn't able to make trades with Tyrone Tracy very well. I wasn't able to make trades with Travis Etienne very well. In some ways, it's kind of straightforward why that would be the case. But I did have some of these lopsided trades that I sent where it was accepted. I got what I wanted, but then the person that I traded the player to was then able to immediately flip them at a great price, where I had not been able to get those prices on the players. Sometimes it's just a matter of like when a trade is sent out, what the person is thinking or feeling at the time, kind of where they are with their roster. Sometimes they're more willing to take a trade from a player's roster in Dynasty that's not loaded, and they're thinking, I'm not going to give him the piece that puts him ahead of me. Whereas maybe if you are the defending champion, or they're looking at your roster and they're thinking, well, I'm certainly not going to help this person. So you just kind of always wonder. I made a trade of someone in Aronde Gadsden for something relatively little, and then Gadsden was immediately flipped for a third, which I thought was shocking. I definitely didn't have any other Aronde Gadsden trades accepted. I had him on the back of most of the rosters. When I was sending out offers of like Gadsden for a 5th, Gadsden for a 6th, those were all auto rejected. So I thought that like quick flip of him for a third was interesting. I go into all that and I bring him up because Gadsden is someone who plays early. There's always a slight chance he has a bigger role than we're expecting. He would be a potential 20th round pick. We're closing in on the 18-19 turn column. What are you seeing here?
Yeah, so we have had a few of the guys we talked about go, and I mentioned I would be surprised if all the QBs, some of them didn't come back. We do see JJ McCarthy, CJ Stroud, and Jordan Love has just been drafted. So we would be down to, in terms of the QB position, the name that we would be kind of looking into here would be Bryce Young, who we could potentially add to the roster if we want to do QB. So there's 3 picks remaining. Jarquez Hunter, who I mentioned earlier, has not been selected. He is still available. Pat Firemouth did get drafted, so he is obviously no longer available. You mentioned Gadsden. At the tight end position, like kind of probably ideally would be adding another piece there. But when we look at the names that are available, the one that I would think that is potentially interesting, that I think is not an exciting pick, but I think it would give you, some. You kind of mentioned if we had to go for a multi-week period where you need the points. I think Juwan Johnson for the Saints probably is somebody who is going to be their starting tight end for the entire season. I think that he would potentially add something there. I see you've added Elijah Arroyo to the mix as well as a potential option. Keandre Lambert-Smith was somebody who we had in the queue. He's after getting drafted. So we are 1 pick away. We're going to have to make a decision. Maybe this is the point that we go QB and another. Maybe this is a point where we take a defense. I feel like, again, the conversation that we were having, you've added Tua and Geno Smith to the QB queue. I think that a QB is possible at that, final pick at the 2012 potentially if we wanted to push it around the turn here. So we do have to take 1 defense before the end here, and we have the options for the other player. So it depends if we want a second QB, another tight end, or another RB, really, for me, along with a defense. Which way do you feel like playing it as the Pittsburgh defense has gone off the board?
Well, I was going to mention the Pittsburgh defense as being a possibility. They get their old QB, and Justin Fields. The other defenses are probably just really not that compelling.
They're not moving the needle. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
I think we probably wait on defense to the end of the road here.
This is going to maybe sound a bit weird, but even though I am not a believer in Arroyo, this price on him is very interesting. I guess it seems like this is Jarquez Hunter plus someone else. Is that what you're thinking as well?
Probably is where I'm leaning here. We waited and we got him back.
So we take Hunter, and then...
So I would feel better having an additional tight end on the roster either way. And if Arroyo comes out in week 1 and, like you mentioned with Gadsden, there's more there than people maybe are expecting. Well, the run to get him off waivers is going to be quite expensive in this format. So I would, if we're going to take Gadsden or Arroyo, I'd probably do it at this particular point. And then I think we just let quarterback go, and we work that out on waivers if we have to do it later. Would you prefer? I would prefer another tight end over one of the quarterbacks. Which would you prefer?
Yeah, that sounds great. And I mean, maybe it's just throwing away a pick, but I do think it's worth seeing how involved Arroyo is in week 1. He's someone...
Seeing your thinking, I'm always interested. It came into my mind when I was making the pick, and the listeners sometimes might want to work through it. We took Kittle. So if you take one of those top guys and you're he's your starter no matter what, unless he's hurt, he's unless something like Kittle completely looks washed after 5 weeks, there's no way we're not putting him in the lineup. So with having a Kittle, I think it gives you a little bit more freedom to be well, he's starting. So if we get this next piece, he has 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. We can kind of have an extended look now at the tight end position with Fannin and Arroyo.
And it's probably something where Fannin has a meaningful role in week 1. Then you're comfortable going down to simply the 2 tight ends. You cut Arroyo. You're probably going to need to make some moves, or just want to make some moves after you get a chance to see week 1. Brashard Smith, someone where it's very likely that you would move off of him. Jarquez Hunter, once you've picked him, you're kind of saying, okay, I'm at least okay with the idea that he's going to be the 3rd stringer to start, and I might have to be patient. And then whether or not you're actually patient is going to depend on who else is out there and what you have to spend to get them. So if you selected Jarquez Hunter, and then there are 3 guys who perform in a way that changes your opinion, or you like them but didn't think they were quite draftable, and then they do well, and you're like, okay, well, now I think they're worth a roster spot, and what I'm going to spend on them for that roster spot is, say, 15 in free agency. You put that in, you are surprised to get them because you thought maybe they would go for 200. Now you have them on your roster. You no longer have Jarquez Hunter. That's kind of the series of events that would lead you to moving off of Hunter, and you'd be fine with it. That's how it's supposed to go. I have a chance to look at Hunter. I get to evaluate him. I'm not so locked onto him that I keep him for 8 weeks if there's nothing there, but I'm also not going to just cut him after 1 week if I have other possibilities for picking things up. But I'm also going to bid somewhat conservatively, because there's a very real chance that I have Jarquez Hunter. He doesn't do anything in week 1. I bid 200 for the guy who's kind of flashy, and then I lose 200 units of bidding. I watch week 2, and it's the exact opposite. And now I'm going to bid 200 to get Jarquez Hunter back. That's one of the reasons why we tend to bid really high for someone who is a difference maker, or pretty low, because then you can, work through that sequencing element where maybe you just tricked yourself. You get, bad luck, or you get unlucky in terms of the order that things happened in, and you positioned your roster in a way that's less favorable and also cost yourself a bunch in the bidding process. Elijah Arroyo may be similar there, where if he doesn't play as much, or AJ Barner actually draws a bunch of targets in addition to being out on the field a lot, because we know he's probably going to be on the field a ton, then you can move off of him. If it turns out that the Seahawks have been playing it a little bit coy, and Arroyo actually has a big role in week 1, then you're like, yeah, we're golden. And the reason that I think you are pretty excited about taking him at 1901 is that, even though he's someone who's pretty cheap, it's still sort of a weird dynamic. We're at the 17-11, which is where he's been going. And then if you've mostly been drafting as, we have at the, with an early spot. So then you're at the 16-17 turn, your real opportunity to get him would be at the same spot that you take Jatavian Sanders, or you take maybe a Pat Bryant or Troy Franklin. You never get him. And yet you do, and you don't think that he probably is worth what a lot of people think, but you also don't discount that completely. The folks who are high on Elijah Arroyo are very good fantasy managers. And so if they're right, then now you've got him at a price that is much more favorable to you. It didn't break down other things you were hoping to do.
The other part of that, and that was part of I want to get back to the kicker element. We take Decker in the 16th round, and he was the second kicker off the board. But when we look then, there's no other kicker drafted to the 19th round. So if we, obviously somebody might have drafted Decker in between, but basically in the 19th round, we would have had our choice of all the other options. I guess we also got a 2-round discount, as you mentioned, on Arroyo, so that doesn't matter. But I do think that having a kicker where you're like, this guy is projected to be an 11-week starter potentially for us bye week in week 12, that also frees up some, if sometimes you're working your way through kickers as well, and then you need to cut a Hunter to be able to get that additional kicker that you may need on the roster. So I think overall, the truth about this for people who have drafted in these sorts of formats for years is often when you look at your team 7 weeks into the season, there's going to be a lot of these double-digit picks that do not remain on the roster. But I feel very optimistic about the names that we've been able to put together. You mentioned Smith, and I think there's enough of a kind of lottery ticket, you called him a black box element to it, to be taking him at that point with the knowledge that it's either going to go up or down. And we should know that pretty quick, I think, for the Chiefs. But I think that there's guys on this roster that because we have taken the running backs at the top end, and because we have the wide receiver depth kind of at the top, that when we look at the Broncos wide receivers plus the likes of Smith and Hunter, kind of gives you that little bit of multi-week flexibility, unless there's something that we really have to have, and the week 2 or week 3 waivers to be able to kind of sit on our hands, sit on our cash, and see how it plays out. So I think the way that the roster's put together kind of is put together with the knowledge that some of that won't work out, and you're kind of insulated from that. But if the players that we've drafted here late hit, then that just adds that kind of rocket fuel to the roster overall. So we're one pick away, Shawn. Which defense is going to be the greatest defense of all time for 2025?
Yeah, this is a little bit crazy. Even waiting on defense, I don't usually get this where we have the choices of
the
3 of the 4.
That we were thinking about taking at the last pick.
Exactly. I mean, 3 of the 4 take a peek defenses. All of them, obviously, other than the Eagles. The Rams are pretty trendy in part because Mike Leone and the great guys over at ETR are fairly high on them. They are here. I mean, it'd certainly be tempting to take the Chiefs or the Chargers and see if they put up some, you could have fluky touchdowns there. Obviously, Justin Herbert melted down in the wild card game last year. Obviously, the Chiefs got crushed in the Super Bowl. And you could have special teams touchdowns and then try and come back and get the Rams. The Rams might get added in that first Wednesday game. Colm, who do you like?
Let's try what you mentioned there in the Chiefs, and we'll try and circle back if we have to get the Rams. Is that what you would have done? I think just you get the luck, and then there is other defenses that we had in the queue. The Jets, the Chargers, the Dallas Cowboys. Now the Chargers obviously are going against the Chiefs, so they don't come into play then for the weekend. But if the Chiefs don't put up the points, I think you would go in and try and add the Rams. And the other reason, Shawn, I think I would do that is I'm only thinking through this now, but everyone else has drafted a defense. So only the teams that would have drafted a look ahead defense are going to realistically look to replace that defense pre-week 1. So I think you should be able to get the Rams if we want to do that pretty straightforward ways.
Yeah. I mean,
it worked out.
It's absolutely perfect because the Eagles, the team that drafted the Eagles, is probably just going to keep the Eagles either way. Right. Now they may actually make a move.
Well, they drafted the Eagles in the 17th round. That was the 3rd defense taken, I believe, maybe the 4th. So I can't see them wanting to just cut bait on that right away.
So Colm, we end up with a team with Bo Nix at quarterback, Jonathan Taylor, RJ Harvey, Cam Scadaboo, Bashal Tootin, Keaton Mitchell, Brashard Smith, and Jarquez Hunter at running back. We have Jamar Chase, Jameson Williams, Jerry Jeudy, Matthew Golden, Luther Burden, Troy Franklin, Pat Bryant at receiver, and George Kittle, Harold Fannin, Elijah Arroyo at tight end. This is both one of my favorite teams ever and one of the most OT teams ever.
It's a very OT team.
What do you think about it? What would you have done differently? I mean, is there anything we could have done differently here? When you want to do something differently, it's usually because you have information later that you didn't have at the time. Because this draft went so magically, I don't know that it delivered us information subsequently that we didn't have in the moment that would change anything. I mean, that's, so that's something that's kind of out of your control. But what are you saying here? Were there some things where if we had simply known something that transpired a little bit down the line, we would have changed picks?
No, I think that most of them fell in our favor. Like, we get a little bit of discount on Taylor. We get Kittle. When you take Kittle, you're wondering, does Hawkinson get back in the sixth? Well, he didn't. Laporta didn't get back. Evan Ingram could have been in play for us potentially. But the way it played out, taking Kittle was like a real strong insurance policy that really cashed in because the other options didn't come into play for us. And then, like, anything that we talked through, like we did the passover on a Dunze to take Golden. Then we did get Borden, who we had talked about. He came back to us. We got, if we're looking at the 0 RB list, we get 4 off that list, with Scadaboo, Tootin, Mitchell, and Smith. And then, like, we get the discount of 2 rounds on Bo Nix. We get the discount of multiple rounds on Arroyo. We get the defense who we were thinking about taking over Arroyo basically gets back to us at the last pick of the draft. We get I didn't think Hunter would have come through to us in this particular draft, so he gets back to us there. We get both of the Broncos to go with Bo Nix. We get Harold Fannin, who we did take ahead of ADP. We want to make sure we got him. Shawn, I think overall, like looking at it, there's not a lot in hindsight that I would change, which is unusual. The one thing I was thinking was, the kicker element. Should we have taken a different play there because of how the kickers then fell through? But if we take a different play there, it's probably to decide to, reach on Jarquez Hunter and pull him up, but he gets back to us. We could have took Pat Freiermuth in that range, but I was kind of hoping that we would be getting him, at his ADP or in the 18th round. So I wouldn't change that Dicker pick either. The players that went after him, Mostert, Sean Tucker, Arizona defense, Trey Harris, Trey Tucker, Darren Waller, Quentin Johnson, JJ McCarthy, CJ Stroud, Philly defense, A.O. Manor, Ferguson, Roshan Johnson, Tyler Lockett, Gorando, Freiermuth, Hill, Jordan Love, Cam Ward, Lambert Smith, Turpin. Then the defense. Like, I'm not like having to have any of those names that go after when we took Dicker and Pat Bryant. So all in all, picking at the turn, as we've touched on a few times, can be a very big challenge. I felt like in this room, a lot of those elements came back to us and made it feel pretty, for being a main event draft, Shawn, sometimes it can add a little bit of extra tension to getting the guys that you want to get. So I think all in all that it was a very relaxed FFPC main event draft.
Yeah, it's so much fun. It worked out more or less perfectly. I do want to ask you about the pick of Brashard Smith there at 1501.
Yeah.
One of the opportunities.
Jatavion Sanders in hindsight?
No, it's more that is the price for DJ Giddens.
Yeah.
In one of the big drafts that Ben and I did recently, we actually, and I don't know how many listeners listened all the way to the point where we kind of admitted this.
Well, I heard this part, yeah.
Yeah. So we accidentally drafted him.
I could have cut this out, Shawn, in post-production if you wanted, but we left it in.
Yeah, we left it in because, I mean, some people are going to have questions about, like, did you guys do that on purpose? Was it because you weren't paying attention? And then you're like, well, it was because we weren't paying attention, but then we like how it ended up because DJ Giddens is so good and Jonathan Taylor is so important. With that dynamic here, is there any part of you that wishes that we had handcuffed our star because we're also very confident in the backup?
My goal is always to avoid handcuffing the running back, especially if you take him in the second round. I guess you could say you take him in the second round, so you handcuff him, to give you that I used the phrase earlier, an insurance policy in case he gets hurt. And Giddens is one of those that we are very strong in. But I would rather be making a Taylor team a non-Giddens team and a Giddens team on a non-Taylor team. And I'd be kind of trying to flip them that way. And I obviously, you could have the element where you're wrong to do that and it would work out better than the other way. But I just think that betting on different pieces hitting in these situations and ending up with the strongest overall roster rather than getting into a situation where you can't cut Giddens all season long because Taylor might get hurt. That would be the concern. Like I could see the Giddens drafter at week 5 in this situation having to make a move to get through the bye weeks, get through those situations, and then he's on the waiver wire, then you have a chance to potentially pick him up. I'm just looking through that particular roster. He went to the Ashton Ginty drafter. He did not draft 9 running backs. It's Ginty, Charbonnet, Garden, Algier, Woody Marks, DJ Giddens, Kendry Miller, Roshan Johnson, Miles Sanders. I can't see that team having 9 running backs on it in week 5. So I'd be looking out to see if he maybe gets cut at that particular point. You mentioned that you did it in error. Is it something that you would do if it's not an error?
I'm with you in that, especially in the best ball, you're looking to not put those pieces together.
You always talk about drafting with humility, but there is also that element like draft this team as if you're right at the same time. Like
there are certain pieces that you need to go right. I think that with DJ Giddens at these prices, right? Because he's not someone who's going in that J.K. Dobbins range or in the Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby range where you could, we drafted Bashal Tutin, so we're like, those people paid a lot for Bashal Tutin's handcuffs.
There's a big similarity in him and let's say we're obviously going with the Jarquez Hunter side of the Rams defense, but you have Tyus Brooks, Blake Corum, along with DJ Giddens are all going in that 15th round range, and then you have Jonathan Taylor, Chase Brown, along with Shawn. We've been going 2 hours. I've had a Kyron Williams, those guys. So they're all kind of in that similar boat. I guess the part that you're saying here is with Giddens, we believe more in his actual standalone or like stepping in and being the true RB1 in the offense if Taylor went down than the other two, or do you think it could work for all 3 of those?
Exactly. No, you're looking at the round 15 pick where we're saying we could take Taj Brooks on the off chance that Chase Brown gets hurt. We're taking Brashard Smith just sort of as a see what he is. Does he have a role type of player? You contrast that with, Rico Dowdle has far less ceiling than DJ Giddens, but goes earlier as a hand. He is a handcuff on this team, but that's not necessarily the intent usually when he goes in that range. You think about names like, some of the people that I named have enough standalone value and people are confident enough in them. You're thinking, well, they're not really drafting those guys as handcuffs. When you take Jonathan Taylor, the whole idea is that you don't expect him to give up much work to other people. But Ollie Gordon, Trey Benson, those are names where, again, somewhat expensive Brian Robinson. Those are guys where, and maybe a little bit less for Benson even than Gordon, even though Gordon goes earlier. But so much of the value is tied up in that handcuff situation. Some of those guys are not as good as DJ Giddens. And again, the difference between a 10th round pick, where there are some very important things that you're still doing in round 10 versus a 15th round pick is very meaningful. And so you think about the different scenarios. Let's say Jonathan Taylor gets hurt in week 3. He's going to be back in week 10. You're going to have him for the run, which is what you want, but you also need to get from week 3 to week 10 without getting yourself eliminated. And DJ Giddens gives you a lot more than Brashard Smith does from that perspective. So I think it's a viable play. I wouldn't necessarily be emphasizing it, but I was kind of happy that it worked out that way on the other team where we did it by accident. I do think that there are so many different ways in which DJ Giddens could actually help you there. And one of the things that you get with a DJ Giddens on a Jonathan Taylor team is that Jonathan Taylor is probably going to actually lose some touches to DJ Giddens, but the backups behind DJ Giddens are so bad that he probably will not lose much to them. Now, some people are going to say, well, that's an exaggeration. Jonathan Taylor is so good. You certainly hope he doesn't give up much. Even if the guys behind DJ Giddens are bad, he'll give up some. But the idea would be is that if Taylor gets hurt and then Giddens actually has a similar role, which in a lot of situations where people are actually using a handcuff, like with Rico Dowdle, if you get a Chuba Hubbard injury, Rico Dowdle's value jumps, but the person whose value really jumps is Trevor Etienne. And so you're thinking through, like, how does that portion of it works? If Christian McCaffrey goes down, then Brian Robinson's value really jumps, but the person whose value really jumps is Isaac Guerrero. So from that perspective, the prices are wrong on some of these backs. That's why some of them are on the 0 RB countdown and some of them are not. Colm, I did want to ask you quickly. You mentioned we were at the 2-hour mark. Part of that was because we were sort of slow at the turn. And so we apologize to our league mates. But again, this is the main event. You want to get the picks right. And if you have a partner, you want to get the picks right in a way that both of you agree with. So,
and
we're
in fairness to us,
205.
Shawn, it did not take us 2 hours to make our selections.
No, it wasn't just us. There were some other slow drafters, which again is fine. You paid for the main event in part so you could enjoy the draft experience. No need to rush through it then. The draft is the best part. It's always fascinating to me where you have a draft is the best part element of fantasy football, and then you get out there and you're doing it, and occasionally some people will be frustrated at the speed. It's like if you're drafting so many teams that the draft isn't the best part, that's unfortunate. It doesn't mean it's wrong. People should certainly have the right to do all of these things in any way that they want to do it. Colm, we had a lot of guys on our startup roster, the Uncle Colm and the Spanish Armada. Again, that doesn't refer to our column. Make sure you check out Your Dairy Girls if you need to get caught up with the references there. I say it's not our column, but it's actually, I mean, the reason I have that for one of my favorite teams is because it's our column as well. So I love that element to it. We made a trade in the last week and a half here where, and some of this we kind of had to do separately, which isn't my favorite thing, but basically I have been such a mess with the different traveling things, trying to handle the different house things, been trying to buy cars for myself and other people. I mean, I'm not paying for them. Don't get me wrong. I'm not of that level of affluence, but with the tax credits coming up, all of that process, and then run different sides of the world. So we're not awake at the same times. I put out a message saying that Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby, Joe Flacco, some other guys were available. We got an offer of Joe Mixon and Tank Dell for them, which, you know, some people are going to be thinking, well, those guys are both hurt and maybe you're done. Why would you trade running backs who in redraft are going in that, 8, 9, 10, 11 range for those pieces? But Colm, with this, it actually lets us stash them. I have no idea what Joe Mixon is going to be. We've never liked Joe Mixon, but if he is even if he's an RB2 over the second half of the season, then he potentially helps you down the stretch. I mean, Tank Dell is now buried on his team's roster with all of the additions the Texans have made. But at one point, it looked like he was going to be a star. I messaged back saying we probably would need another little piece, asking for a Kyle Manon guy. Kendre Miller flip. Obviously, Kendre Miller right now is probably at the best point that he's been in for a while. So moving Kendre Miller along, maybe the opposing manager wins that side of it as well. What were your thoughts on this that I pulled off in the middle of the night without your input? And how do you like where our roster is now?
Yeah, this was one, Shawn, where I was like, these are I know we've liked Kendre Miller in the past, and then I'm looking through these names. I'm like, I don't know what side of this trade is actually for us, and what, normally it'll be like these are our guys, and we're moving our guys, or we're trying to acquire this guy. I was like, there's a lot of names here that we're not usually trying to get either way. I actually think with the cut downs and being able to put the two guys on injured reserve, and Tank Dell may never be the same again, unfortunately, but prior to his injury, and especially prior to the first injury that he suffered, like a lot of talent in Tank Dell, and we were very excited about him. So even if it's a case that, you just get him and he gets back and he's somewhat healthy and there's some buzz around him, you might be able to move him, or you could keep him on your roster. The same with Joe Mixon. The Joe Mixon injury news is very concerning, and there's, I think, a strong possibility that he doesn't play at all this season. But if he does come back in prior to the deadline for trades, we may be able to use him, or we'll be able to as well potentially flip him. It may turn out that all the like the most valuable piece may be Monange out of the entire trade, but I do think that we're like kind of trying to get down to the cut down, so we're moving like Bigsby and Etienne, who I think will, out of the players here, score the most fantasy points out of this cohort this season. So we're probably giving up some, short-term pain for long-term gain. I think long-term, we come out on top on this particular deal. Realistically, we were going to have to cut some of these guys anyway, and they were two that are kind of hard to trade, and also you wouldn't want to cut based on the expectations for Bigsby and Etienne this season. So a fun trade, and Shawn mentions, the situation. Shawn has been hard at work on these cut downs. That's one of the joys of having like an almost 1-year-old son. Your trade negotiation duties sometimes get bypassed. So I'm grateful to Shawn for getting these moves made. And Shawn, we have some championships to win on the dynasty side as well. So hopefully I also noticed over on the FFPC a nice little crown beside the names now when you are the champion. So I believe that stays there for the whole season. So that's nice to go in and look at each time you're going to set up your lineups as well. So hopefully we can retain that crown and add some more to it over the course of the season. But Shawn, this main event has been a lot of fun. It's challenging from the turns as we talked about, but really excited for how this roster turned out. We'll keep the listeners updated throughout the season, hopefully each week, where we tell them that we are 1-0, 2-0, 3-0, and continues on up to 12-0. Shawn, maybe we'll go unbeaten this season, and that will be the fun of 2025. But long way to go for the fantasy season. I did mention this on that other podcast that I did as well, but I want to mention it here, and Shawn may want to say it as well. If you've got through this 2 hours of the podcast, listen to us in the whole draft, we do hope that you all have a very good 2025 fantasy football season and bring home those championships. It's a fun time of the year, Shawn, where we get to talk about this on a weekly basis, and a lot of people listen in and are very kind when they reach out, and we have conversations with them. But we hope that the OT and the RotoViz at large community have a very successful season this year.
We do. Thank you so much for all of 2025. Good luck to everyone. We hope that you, like us, and Colm doesn't exist there, but I know that you are having a great Labor Day in spirit. We love all you guys.
Shawn almost got the Stadium Bananas outro in there. I'll finish it off by saying you can sign up to RotoViz and get 10% off with the code RVRadio2025. You can check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. You can follow me on socials at Overtime Ireland. And until we are back, have a good one.